One of the most disgusting things that a woman during the Second World War could have done in the eyes of many was to sleep with the enemy or the Germans. Across France, as the Allied forces freed villages and towns, they were met with a shocking scene which became known as the Ugly Carnival. The French were relieved that the Germans had been forced out of their homes and towns, but then the French resistance sought to punish women who were linked to what was known as horizontal collaboration. The French persecuted thousands of women who were forced to undergo a humiliating and horrific ordeal inside of towns and cities. These scenes haunted many Allied soldiers who saw it and were appalled by the actions of the French. In this episode, we look at the most humiliating punishments of women in World War II. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the Second World War, the German army captured and controlled a huge chunk of countries and territories across all Europe. After the surrender and defeat of a country, the Germans would follow this and station armies in the occupied countries and try to govern them as Nazi states and impose their Nazi policies, rules, and laws. Most Germans would try to settle in these occupied territories. For instance, after the capture of Paris, many of the soldiers visited brothels and coffee shops and were photographed doing so. During their stay, most of the German soldiers looked for women to court, but to the surprise of many, a huge number of women inside of France would voluntarily fall in love with the German soldiers and willingly engage in relations with these soldiers. On the other hand, some women only collaborated with the German soldiers as it was a vital lifeline as conditions and supplies became even scarcer during this time. They believed the Germans would give them food in exchange for certain special favors. Some German soldiers even went as far as to offer the women marriage. Many would later return to Germany with their girlfriends and start a family. In many countries, the women who engaged with the enemy were considered to be collaborators and were complicit of the wrongs of the occupants. Following the liberation of France, thousands of women were punished in a terrible series of events that would be known as the Ugly Carnival. The Ugly Carnival was harrowing for many to witness. Women were rounded up by the French resistance and by local authorities and were then gathered in public settings and town squares. These women were then forced to have their heads shaved. Across Europe, this practice was done for years and was considered a humbling punishment for women. The crowds of spectators in France were incredibly angry, and the scenes were like those in medieval time punishments. Following having their heads shaved, the women were then paraded in crowds where they would be subjected to verbal abuse and humiliation. Some were covered in tar to stand out even more. Their foreheads were then drawn on with paint, mostly with Nazi symbols showing everyone what their crime was. Most of these women were just suspected of having collaborated with the enemy and would be innocently subjected to this punishment. It didn't just happen in France. Other countries in occupied Europe, including Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Norway, witnessed similar acts, albeit on a smaller scale. Recognizing these women now is an important step in acknowledging the long history of gender inequality. With little ability to defend themselves, no courts, no juries, the women became the public target of a humiliated nation, a convenient scapegoat to pummel, demean, and discard, all in an attempt to wash away the shame of defeat and submission the country had suffered. The suspicion and punishment of women after World War II is part of a cycle of repression and sexism that began long before D-Day and continues to be seen today in the conversation around various movements. Thank you for watching the video. Leave us your thoughts in the comments down below.